family redeemer. To reflect noble character, we are to demonstrate respect and concern for one another. Here's Dr. Gene Getz.
Now, again, we're getting into a cultural dynamic here that's far removed really from our particular situation, but the principle is the same. The principle is supercultural. So here's the passage, Ruth chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, Chilion and Mahlon, which were the two sons. I will also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, not in the sense of purchasing her, but acquiring her according to God's law to take care of her. I will also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property, so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his home. You are witnesses today." Now, what we have here is a tradition, and let me give you a couple of statements that grow out of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. God made provisions coming out of the land of Egypt, establishing the nation of Israel for these situations. And simply, here's a summary, God's family plan for Israel. In the laws of Israel, God had provided a redemptive plan for protecting the interests of needy members of an extended family. And here, Ruth is part of this extended family along with Naomi. In Ruth's case, it involved providing an heir for a relative who had died, her father-in-law, Elimelech. And Deuteronomy chapter 25 gives you a rather lengthy passage on dealing with this for the children of Israel. This is a specific plan for Israel. The plan is not relative to us, but the principle is relative to us. That's what makes these principles supercultural. The plan involved to redeem land that a poor person, Naomi, had sold outside the family, and Leviticus chapter 25 deals with that particular situation. So Boaz is stepping up to the plate with family responsibility and care, and I believe with also blended with romantic interests in this young woman. God's family plan for Israel continues. We see ultimately the family redeemer who had first rights refused those rights and gave Boaz freedom not only to acquire Naomi's property but also to secure Ruth as his bride. That was another provision. There was one who was classified as the family redeemer by priority, and in this case Boaz needed to determine who that person was to be free to do what he wanted to do for Ruth. So, with that public action, Boaz once again demonstrated why he was a prominent man of noble character, practicing this Old Testament law. So here we have this plan of the family redeemer, and it's related for respect and concern for one another, and it's a reflection of noble character. And God has established that principle from Genesis to Revelation, and that is noble character. Now, in the Old Testament, they didn't practice it very well. Boaz is an exception to the rule. It's amazing. But he was a man of noble character in the midst of all of this horrible sin and idolatry that existed even within Israel. You get in the New Testament, you see the importance of noble character, particularly in leadership. When Paul came to Lystra, Timothy's hometown, and Timothy had become a believer on Paul's first missionary journey. When Paul returned, the brothers, we read in Acts 16:2, the brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke highly of him. And that's what got Paul's attention. This young man had come to Christ. Now, fortunately, Timothy, through his mother, had known the Holy Scriptures since he was a child. And when Paul came preaching the gospel of Jesus, Timothy recognized, along with his mother, that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, responded to the gospel, and began to grow in his faith. And when Paul returned to that city and to that church in Lystra, Timothy had grown and developed this wonderful reputation. And there are three things that pop out of that succinct verse. It's amazing what you can get just from that simple verse. Let me read that verse again. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke highly of him. Now, what are the three things that come out of that verse? First of all, people said good things about him. Good reputation. Noble character. They were saying that about Boaz in the Bethlehem community. They were saying that even about Ruth once she became known in that community. Good things. And that should be one of our goals. The good things that people say about us is they trust us. They believe in our character. They believe we're telling the truth. We're honest. We're open. We're men and women of integrity. And secondly, in this little verse, more than one person said good things about him. Not just your favorite person. Not just a political spokesman. Not someone who's just trying to make you look good or cover up, but people who really know you. Both the brothers in both places were saying good things about them. And more than one person, the brothers. But in more than one place, which is the third point, more than one person in more than one place said good things about him. Isn't it amazing what you can get out of one just little text of Scripture when you see it in the light of whole of Scripture? And this verse is really teaching character and the importance of character in our lives. Now, the reflection response question is, what are some specific steps that we can take in our culture to develop a good reputation among both Christians and non-Christians, in essence, to be men and women of noble character? Well, I think the Bible gives us the more specific answers to that question. And as I reflected on that question, and when I write out these questions, then I force myself to answer them. And I have to go back and say, okay, what are the real answers to that question? And as I faced this question, my mind went back to that which is very, very biblical. A biblical answer to that question. And when we go back to 1 Timothy chapter 3, and I'm just going to take you to the Scriptures here, where Paul is writing to Timothy about those in spiritual leadership, and he says, this saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to be an overseer, an elder, a pastor, he desires a noble work, an overseer, pastor, elder, therefore, must be above reproach or have a good reputation. Noble character. But then Paul tells us, at least in this situation, for these men who are to be in spiritual leadership, what creates that good reputation first and foremost. And right at the top of the list, the husband of one wife, or a man of one woman, or moral purity. And the interesting thing is, if you go to the book of Titus, where Paul was dealing with the same issues of appointing spiritual leaders, the thing that came right out at the top of the list to develop this good reputation, noble character, is moral purity. A man of one woman. See, this is God's ideal. It was ever since God created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Polygamy came in after that, but that was something God allowed because of man's sinful condition. It wasn't God's ideal, and whenever it happened, it created all kinds of problems in the family. You can see that very clearly. So, a man of one woman is God's plan to build character. Because if you can't trust a man, morally, you can't trust him. People who are immoral will lie. 2 + 2 = 4. Always. Immorality equals dishonesty and lying. And I've had people look me right straight in the eye when I've asked them, is there another woman in your life? And they've looked at me, Gene, how could you ever ask that question? Later I found out they were lying through their teeth. And in our culture, you've seen that happen many, many times. It's unfortunate. And it's something that just happens. And if you can't trust a man to tell you the truth, to be truthful with his wife, you can't trust him to be truthful with anything. I've had to learn that because I'm a very trusting person. I want to believe what people tell me. But I know that people have lied to me. And I found that out later. So if you want to develop a good reputation, Paul says that's the first thing. Now he goes on to list a number of other things for developing this good reputation, such as being self-controlled and sensible and respectable and hospitable, gentle, and so forth. But let me share something else that's very interesting. That question, and let me read that question again because I want to underscore this. What are some specific steps we can take in our culture to develop a good reputation among both Christians and non-Christians, in essence, to be men and women of noble character? And we've dealt with what Paul zeroes in on here with men, particularly. But he also deals with the subject of women, because if you go down into the passage in 1 Timothy, he talks about women who are in leadership roles must be worthy of respect, and that's a good reputation. And then he says, not slanderers. Now that's fascinating. The first thing he says is not a woman of one man or moral purity. He says not a slanderer in developing a good reputation. And they'll say, well, Gene, what are you trying to say? Well, let Paul say it again. If you go to Titus, in chapter 2, we have another model for women. And here's what Paul says in 2 Timothy, or Titus chapter 2, verse 3. In the same way, older women are to be reverent in behavior, which means a good reputation. Same thing. Noble character. Reverent in behavior. What's the next phrase? Not slanderers. In both passages. Now, isn't it interesting that in these passages in 1 Timothy and Titus for men, the first things at the top of the list is moral purity. Man and one woman. But when it comes to women, in both passages, 1 Timothy, Titus, both books, to develop a good reputation, not slanderers, not slanderers. Now, does that mean that women are not tempted to be immoral? No. But the scriptures are clear, and human life is clear, and history is clear, that that's a man's vulnerability, is moral purity. And history and the Bible verifies that a woman's vulnerability is what she says and how she says it in terms of gossip and hurting people with the tongue. Doesn't mean that a man doesn't have that problem too, because men can be vitriolic, and they can be wicked, and they can be evil. But what Paul's dealing with here, by the Spirit of God, is our vulnerability, our area of vulnerability. For men, we've got to guard our minds and our hearts in terms of moral purity. When Jesus said, when a man looks on a woman to lust after her, he didn't say a woman looking on a man to lust after him. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but what's a man's area of vulnerability? And if you want to study that for Scripture, you can see it from Genesis to Revelation, taking one of the supreme examples in the Old Testament, and that's David himself, a man after God's own heart. What was his downfall? It's what he saw. And so consequently, we have to be incredibly committed to these principles. And here in Scripture, we have tremendous truth. Now, we have additional character traits for men and women, as we looked at for men. For example, in Titus, in this passage, he talks about the older women, reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not addicted to much wine. They can teach what is good so that they may encourage the young women to love their husbands. That's a character trait. And their children to be sensitive, pure, good homemakers, submissive to their husbands, so that God's message will not be slandered. So there are other characteristics from the Scriptures that help us to become men and women of noble character. What I've just focused on is what God, through the Spirit of God, through Paul, put at the top of the list in terms of developing our reputation, both as men and as women.